Hello there. Welcome back, but not to Ace Attorney Online this time, or to uh, fan translation of Ace Attorney 3, which we played last time. Instead, uh, this is a game on itch.io, and actually, this is related to something we have played before on the channel. Uh, it's set. It's I believe so. It's in the same setting as Malleus Maleficarum, The Witch of San Ignacio, which is a case that I really enjoyed. It's in the same setting but with different characters. So yeah, I haven't even given this a little look through. So I don't even know anything about it other than the description you see here. Um, but we'll give it a shot and we'll see. Um, we'll see what this is about. So without further ado, before the beginning of this tale, a few words in order to better help prepare the reader. Quiero Matarte, and I looked up the title. It translates to I already knew Quiero from my Spanish lessons. GCSE, I got a 6, which is it's above a pass, but not by much. But the Matarte part means like to kill, so it's like I want to kill you, which is an interesting title. It's a work that contains depictions of bigotry, particularly discrimination against sexual minorities and self-loathing with regards to sexuality. So I guess that's your trigger warning, but we kind of dealt with some of that in Malleus, so if you're coming off the back of that, then I think you'd be well prepared anyway. A crucial part of the setting has to do with witch hunts and how they were weaponized against people who are othered by society. While this work is set in an alternate history, much of it is still based on our own. Please take care of yourself and know that you are loved, even if the characters within the story engage in acts of hatred. In addition to that, Quiero Matarte contains descriptions of death and violence, though nothing super detailed or explicit. First published work using Twine, for the most part it's a linear story of only one way to interact in the text, with a few notable exceptions where to get more details on the setting or make a choice of sorts. When you reach that point, do worry too much about feeling that you'd have to have reread the story. There'll be something in the credits to take you back if you'd like. The goal is to make it so reading everything is simple too. Well, that's good because you know me, I'm a completionist. Thank you for your time. I hope you really enjoyed this little story of mine. Let's begin. Well, let's begin then. Without further ado. So I'm going to have to be reading speech now, and I'll be probably coming up with some voices on the fly. I'm surprised that you haven't ended this already. Is this purely out of spite, or are you just trying to delay the inevitable? Martha took another look at the room she was in. It was barren and miserable looking sort of place. For some reason she found humour in the fact that it really seemed like somewhere that someone would die. For one reason or another. The log cabin she found herself in was technically supposed to be a makeshift holding cell of some sort, but there was little indication of that. There wasn't much of anything in the cabin aside from a makeshift bed tucked away in a corner. She had messed up, irreversibly, but she knew there was always a possibility when she'd taken on such a major role in a prison break operation to free the heretics that she knew had done nothing wrong. But she hadn't expected to die immediately. No, but she expected to die immediately, not to be struck unconscious when she ran into one of the soldiers. Maybe if she hadn't been so surprised by her face, she would have... No, those were excuses. It was pointless to feel regret over her past mistakes, but she would forever indulge in this pointless activity like clockwork. Her eyes looked around the room. There really wasn't much to look at. Even if she did find anything particularly interesting, it wasn't like she could give anything a close examination. Her arms and legs were bound by rope. She hadn't realised just how frustrating it would be to have her movement completely restricted until she experienced it firsthand. At least she could freely move her head and eyes. She still had her voice, and nothing else. The lack of anything to look at in the gloomy log cabin more or less forced her to acknowledge the only other person in the room, regardless of her own thoughts on the matter. A young woman around the same age as her, holding a knife in her hands and looking down at her. She held the knife with both of her hands, as if to keep her aim as steady as possible, despite the fact that one hand would have been more than enough. It was a very small blade, but of course even the tiniest blade could still kill the same. She seemed hesitant to answer Marta's inquiry, though Marta had already resigned herself to the possibility that she'd never get to hear any sort of answer at all. What was that inquiry? So it was... Yeah. She wants to know. She wants to know why you haven't just stabbed me and get it over with. She's just sort of surprised that she's even still alive at this point. I guess being captured isn't really something that... Taken alive isn't something that normally happens in the situation. Being close to death made her oddly feel at peace. Maybe she really was as disturbed as other people said she was. But then she heard her speak. It wasn't supposed to be like this. That's all. I'm hoping I can wake up from this long nightmare and just pretend everything's normal again. They had been best friends once. Some part of her still considered them as such. But friends didn't have these sort of complicated feelings about each other, or at least she hoped not. Marta smiled and gave a simple reply. If this is a nightmare, then I hope I never wake up from it. Raina looked away from Marta's eyes for a moment. Her eyes seemed transfixed on the knife she was holding. The two of them had grown up together and had been close. For the longest time, Raina had been certain that she and Marta would be close friends until they passed away of old age. This was how it was supposed to be. Another knife in her hand seemed like it was inevitably going to deny that future, and it would carve open a bleaker one in its place. She turned up... She didn't turn up. She looked up and turned towards Marta once again. Raina saw someone who inevitably had to be her enemy, even if she was a friend once. Someone who was deemed a witch by society, and as an executioner, the two were natural antagonists to one another. Severing the connection between them was the most natural thing possible. It should be natural anyway. I feel sinful just looking at you, you know. This will all be over soon. And I'll feel normal again, right? Raina could barely even tell what the question she asked was supposed to mean. She didn't know if she was asking Marta or if she was asking herself. Neither one particularly made a lot of sense to her. For her part, Marta kept her face as neutral as possible, at least as neutral as she could manage. She was a woman of around 24 years old. Wavy brown hair matched her brown eyes. Her olive skin covered in scars and bruises. Her clothes, a dark green cloak that camouflaged well in the forest, was covered in blood and dirt. How much of that blood was her own and how much of it wasn't was a question that Raina dared not ask her. Either answer would be unpleasant for different reasons. Even though she was bound, battered and beaten, there was still a glint of her usual energy in her eyes. Raina couldn't help but still find her beautiful, despite everything. Was it wrong that she seemed all the more beautiful now, actually? Scratch that. There was clearly something very wrong with her. Marta gave a toothy grin. It looked just like it always had, back when they were children, but they weren't children now. If they were, maybe things would be simpler, or maybe Raina was just in denial. Marta gave a rather pointed reply that completely contrasted with the grin on her face. If normal is supposed to mean killing a whole bunch of people until people stop being abnormal, then I don't think it's worth aspiring to. You have to see that, right? Or has the church sunk its claws that deep into you? Normal. By all accounts, Raina should have been the most normal and virtuous of the two, while Marta was an evil witch who was clearly abnormal. Yet she felt disgust with the label that should have brought her comfort. Just how had things ended up this way? Why was she even questioning that? It didn't really matter that much at this point. From Marta's point of view, it really felt like it would have been fine if she died in that moment. If she had to die, then it was for the best that it was at Raina's hands. She looked up at her. It was so strange. She could still remember when she towered over Raina, but now the two of them were more or less the same height. And of course, the fact that she was on the ground while Raina was standing just made that even odder to think about. Marta really felt like she must have been out of her mind. Why was she thinking about all this nonsense when death's embrace could strike her at any moment? Maybe it was because Raina didn't look like a killer, even though Marta knew for a fact that she executed several witches in the past. Some of those witches had been her friends as well. Well, alright, she should have been deeply fearful, perhaps angry. Really anything except for the absence of anything she felt. Raina had black hair that she let flow freely in the wind. When they were younger, Marta had delighted in taking every excuse she could to run her hands through her hair. Aside from her face, she didn't expose much in the way of skin. She wore a black tunic that vaguely resembled a nun's habit, even though she wasn't technically a member of the clergy. Her hands were covered in white gloves that served to protect them. Her beautiful hands, meant for playing the piano, or at least they had been once. Marta had no idea if she even played the piano anymore. Unlike Marta's brown eyes, Raina's were a rather striking green. Highly unusual where they were from. She'd even been the target of unsavoury rumours at one point. She also suspected that either her mother or her father had foreign blood in them. But all that fear-mongering seems so distant now. Or, to be more precise, it's been replaced by more recent fear-mongering. Raina continued to be silent. Eventually, Marta decided to take the next move and raised her voice again. So, is there any reason you didn't take the chance to slit my throat already? You have to have had several chances by now. I know you're not planning on letting me go, so don't get my hopes up. Would it really be that unusual? Raina's reply was solemn, but it was nearly immediately greeted by dry laughter. Martha just repeatedly shook her head as if Raina said the most absurd impossibility in the world. In a manner of speaking, she wasn't wrong, and her response was an appropriate one. I've seen the wanted posters, you know. They captured me pretty well, and now you've captured me well. But these posters make one thing very clear. I'm only valuable as a corpse. If you bring me to the church alive, then they'll just kill me right then and there. Won't you grant me the mercy of at least not dying at the hands of a stranger, Raina? The wanted posters. Raina remembered the first time she had seen them. She had seen very suspected witches on those posters. It all seemed perfectly normal to her, until the first day that she had seen Marta's likeness on one. She couldn't stop herself from thinking back to that day. If she had to name a specific event that changed everything, she probably couldn't. It would be simplifying things too much. But one of the easiest events to point to was the death of Esperanza Guerrero, a prominent figure in the church that was more or less the authority in all but name. Is that, because I'm thinking, is that the person who serves as a judge in Malleus? It might have been. Or I might be completely off base, but I guess there might be more description. It had been a complete disaster of a day. The stench of death and ash was something that she swore she could still recall during her most vulnerable moments. She had only seen the aftermath, but it still haunted her. A few weeks prior to that day, Bishop Guerrero had put pressure on a large library that had secretly been housing many suspected witches and foreigners who drew the ire of many in the capital. Raina could no longer recall the full details and names of those involved, but she could still remember the fire. When she closed her eyes, she still felt like she could see the blaze in front of her eyes. The library itself wasn't the victim of the blaze, though that perhaps would have been a better fate. All of the people who had taken refuge in it were forced out by the church's soldiers, and included those who didn't have homes. The unfortunate souls would have relied on the library to have a roof over their heads. Many of those people perished and died in the frost of the winter. I do want to click on this. The name Esperanza Guerrero was one that provoked very mixed reactions depending on who you said it to. A high-ranking church official who believed actions spoke just as loudly as words did, who often seemed vigorous and full of life well into her later years. Before her death, she had made quite a name for herself as a very ardent supporter of the witch hunts, to the point that she'd often travel around the country and go into various smaller villages in order to better assess any rumours of witch activity. None could doubt that she was more active than the average church official, or she seemed to be a true believer in the cause. She was often said to believe that they were really purging places of sin and making things go back to the way they should be. Much of the controversy surrounding her stemmed from the fact that she had to take a leading role in witch trials, often supplanting any assigned judges if a case happened to catch her interest. So yep, this is her. For obvious reasons, this was seen as a rather blatant power play by some. She also had a very well-known distrust for anyone she deemed an outsider. Whether you liked her or not seemed to depend entirely on how much you agreed with her beliefs. In other words, she was basically the platonic ideal of what the old guard faction within the church valued. However, she also had a healthy amount of experience as a judge and was said to often be willing to hear out any supposed witches who weren't convicted just yet. Her only mercy and temperance went out the window as soon as she was certain someone was a disturbance to the natural order of things. A decent number of witch trials she oversaw resulted in re-education of the supposed witches rather than a death penalty. Though this re-education could be considered the worst fate depending on who you asked. She was gone now, but her impact on the world remained. Raina had never known Bishop Guerrero personally. It was hard to find someone in the church who wasn't influenced by her in some way. either as an example of what to follow or what not to strive for, depending on the person. She tried to refocus her thoughts back to where they were. So we're back here. We'll just click Frost of Winter now. Not long after that, the home of Bishop Quiero was set ablaze by a group of terrorists. The bishop, a controversial figure who had equally as many proponents and detractors, perished from breathing in smoke long before the fire ever reached her. When had no idea exactly who was responsible for the bishop's death, that was thought to be the work of either witch sympathizers, seeking revenge, or foreign spies. Perhaps both, depending on who you asked. As callous as it sounded, Reina no longer cared who exactly was responsible for that horrible blaze. All it to Reina was that Marta had been one of the people who was helping those witches hide away, and so she was likely one of the suspects for being involved in the bishop's death. Even if she wasn't involved, the fact remained she'd been caught aiding the vile deceivers known as witches. Witches, people who were thought to possess magic granted to them through demonic rituals, and need to be either slain or undergo re-education depending on just how far gone they were. Those who were abnormal in some way, and drifted from what a normal person should be like. The church itself was split on how best to handle them. For the longest time, Reina had believed in the righteousness of that cause. How could she not? Villains existed only to be slain by heroes, after all. And her childhood friend had been helping hide those supposed villains. Before long, Marta found her name and likeness on a wanted poster that declared she was a suspected witch. Even Reina could tell how strangely spurious the accusation was, but she tried to push away her doubts. After all, even if Marta wasn't truly a witch, she was clearly collaborating with them. And it would explain why Marta had always made her feel the way she did. It would explain everything. But she needed to stop retreating to the past. What mattered right now was the present. Are you really just going to stand there with that knife in your hand without doing anything? Marta's words snapped Reina out of her trance. She was right about one thing. She couldn't exactly just stand around and do nothing forever. But she could at least delay what she had to do. It was pure cowardice, but she had never been a particularly brave person. Anytime she was ever able to summon up her courage, it was always when she truly didn't need it. Reina cleared her throat and did her best to sound imposing. I need information from you. You can't talk if you're dead, can you? Is that really how you're going to play this? What kind of information could I even offer you at this point? Marta asked. There was no mirth in her voice, not even an attempt at faux warmth. She genuinely seemed puzzled by Reina's approach. So, Reina decided to be a little more specific. Anything to keep the conversation going. You could tell me about who was involved in your little prison break back there. Surely you know the names and faces of your comrades, right? Or did terrorists hide that even from each other? That earned her a glare from Marta. If it wasn't for the rope, she was certain that Marta would have tried hitting her. We're not terrorists, damn it! The only ones inflicting terror are... forget it, you've heard this all before. I'm not going to convince you, am I? We're rebels, not terrorists. We're helping people. This time it was Reina's turn to laugh. And what's so funny? Marta asked, not even bothering to hide the exasperation in her voice. Reina had kept a distance from Marta. Despite the fact that she was one with all the power in the situation, it made her seem almost afraid of Marta. But then illusion was dispelled before long. She took several steps forward and crouched so that her gaze met Marta's. The knife in her hands now seemed like a much more real, visceral threat. Marta still couldn't quite make out her true intentions. For a moment, Marta wondered if this was it. Maybe Reina would finally stab her without explanation and be done with it, leaving her question unanswered. She might even welcome it at this point. Surprisingly, when she stashed the knife away in her pocket, she knelt down to get to eye level with Marta and stared directly at her. Unsure of what to make of this development, Marta scarcely even dared to breathe. This would have been so much simpler if Reina was merely being imposing or outwardly hostile, but the complete absence of anything in her eyes wasn't doing her any favours for figuring out what her next move was going to be. And so, some time passed. Marta felt as if the whole world had simply stopped. Marta couldn't stop herself from reminiscing about what they were once like. Maybe this was her life flashing before her eyes. She had thought it would be more unpleasant than this, but it felt strangely soothing despite the circumstances. The Reina in front of her was replaced in her mind's eye by one from about half a decade ago, back when Reina wasn't a church soldier. back when Marta wasn't a secret member of an organisation dedicated to freeing witches through any means possible. At that time, they were just a musician and a farmer. Neither particularly well off, but at least they had each other. It was easy to get nostalgic for those days and forget any hardships they had once faced. Memories of a bad habit of either washing away pain or emphasizing it. There was seemingly no in between. Or at least, that was what they had always been like for her. They had been close, intimate friends once, but they could never be more than that. And Marta had thought that her feelings were impure and tainted, so she never tried to act on them. Which is why she had been surprised when Raina had been the one to tacitly reveal her affection first, of course. That only resulted in regrets down the line. Was that moment of happiness worth all the suffering that ensued? She couldn't even remember the full details of what happened. Raina had performed exceptionally well in a recital and had caught the eye of a noble family. For a poor musician from a family who didn't have a patron, it should have been wonderful. Raina would have been able to provide for herself and her family as long as she maintained favour with that noble family, and Marta should have been happy for her. But all she could think was that it was the moment that Raina's life had been irreversibly ruined. Sometimes she felt awful about cursing her friend's happiness, but she tried to convince herself that it wasn't true happiness. Of course, she was probably just trying to make herself feel better as a show for her own feelings. She could say that it was about Raina as much as she liked, but the truth was that she knew how selfish she was being. It was really about herself and the feeling that someone she loved had been robbed from her. That was the last night that she felt that the two were close in the way they always had been. There had always been an air of plausible deniability to their relationship. The acts of intimacy they engaged in went beyond what would be proper for two close women to engage in. But as they grew older, Marta could tell their behaviour was being seen as stranger and stranger. Their youth was no longer an excuse they could fall back on, so the amount of shared embraces and tender moments lessened. Until all too suddenly they came to a stop once Raina became favoured by a noble family and began meeting them. They had poisoned her, as far as Marta was concerned. She never said it outright, but Marta was certain it was an ability that had changed Raina for the worse. It was the only explanation that made any sense to her. More importantly, it was the only explanation that allowed her to direct her anger at someone who wasn't Raina or herself. Self-flagellation would only make things worse, and she needed to use her fury for something. Maybe it was just Marta's way of feeling better for herself, but she felt like she saw regret in Raina's eyes whenever she had to turn her down from then on. But how miserable it was that Marta had to hope for Raina's misery to feel any trace of happiness. The two had gone in wildly divergent paths from each other, and both emerged in completely different positions. How had a musician with beautiful hands and a wide-eyed idealism become a roughened soldier in the church's employ? And how had a poor farm girl who was entirely illiterate become a member of a resistance group that fundamentally opposed the church in their witch hunts, as an informant who was apparently quite skilled at reading and writing, no less? What had mattered was that they had met again. You have a beautiful voice, even when you're saying such awful things. Raina's words broke her out of her reminiscing. The blank look in her eyes had been replaced by pure fury, even as her voice remained even-tempered. What part of what I said is supposed to be awful, Raina? As far as I'm concerned, I've said nothing but the truth. So that's how you justify killing your fellow countrymen who are just doing their jobs? The doting witch really must have brainwashed you if you can justify killing so many people like that. I wonder how many of them were soldiers of the church I knew. How many were gods I had passed by? Well, Marta? As Raina spoke, she began placing her arms around Marta's neck. However, she applied no pressure just yet. Marta hadn't been robbed of her ability to speak just yet. If Raina had intended to intimidate her then, her plan had backfired. The fire in Marta's eyes grew ever brighter as Raina spoke. Marta had a lot that she wanted to say, but she kept it simple. And how many people have been killed by the witch hunts whose only crime was being some sort of outsider? If you want to judge people for killing, you should judge our country for allowing far greater numbers to die in the name of appeasing the few. Raina took a deep breath after listening to Marta's words. She began squeezing Marta's neck. The pressure was slight at first, but rapidly increased. All the monster could do was try to let any pain show in her eyes, if there would be any sort of meaningful victory here. It was pure stubbornness, basically. I wish I could hate you. Why can't I? The doting witch. Why did you have to join up with them, of all people? If you'd at least join the reformists, we wouldn't be enemies. Not like this, anyway. I'm pretty sure the doting witch... Yeah, it is. It's Dot from Malleus, the main character, in fact. The leader of this resistance group. These were the terms that had been important to Marta once, but she was far more focused on trying to keep herself conscious. However, Reina was free to think about the group that Marta was now part of. Her enemy. It was tempted to take her mind off things and go over history, despite the circumstances, which will do. The witch hunts had always been the subject of resistance and controversy. From the very start, there were always groups that either tried to put a stop to them or lessen how omnipresent the witch hunts were, or at the very least, try to put them under closer scrutiny and have the church hold the inquisitors more accountable. These groups could be divided into those that chose violence and directly opposed the church as a whole, and the groups that sought a non-violent solution to try and reform the church from within to put a stop to the witch hunts. Of course, Reina didn't particularly care to capture the nuances of either group. Her own explanation was a rather simple one that didn't always align with reality. It was strange to think how calmly she could think about all this while squeezing Marta's neck. It was like she was watching someone else engage in a violent act while her mind simply was somewhere else. Even she could tell there was something deeply wrong with her for being able to manage this. She looked at Marta, whose skin seemed to grow paler and paler by the second. Marta had joined with one of those violent groups, led by a mysterious figure known as a doting witch. A masked figure whose identity, name, and even gender was unknown. Someone who apparently claimed to not even be certain of their own gender from the sounds of it. A radical figure whose past was the subject of many rumours, though Reina only saw them as the person who had stolen her best friend away from her. Regardless of what the actual facts were, the fact that they had already drifted apart before then barely even registered to her. The church was broadly split into three opposing factions: the old guard, the moderates, and the reformists. This was another broad generalisation that didn't capture the nuances of the many people who went loyal to one specific group and whose beliefs were more conflicted, but it was an explanation that was simple enough to follow. Of course, the reformists were currently spearheaded by a man known by the name of Billy Vargas, who was well known for never directly engaging in acts of violence the way a group like the Doting Witches did. If Marta joined the reformists instead, who advocated for non-violence and generally didn't engage in ridiculous flights of fancy like massive prison breaks, then maybe... she was being foolish, of course. There were always plenty of rumours that some of the reformers were secretly helping the rebel groups and weren't as opposed to violence as they claimed. So why was she hoping that Marta would be with them instead? So she could have an easier time justifying her supposed betrayal? No. That was enough of all this. The history of all this, none of it mattered right now. She was trying to distract herself from what needed to be done. It was just the two of them in that room. She had to stay focused. But actually, we're not going to stay focused. We're going to click on Billy Vargas because you might well remember him from Malleus as being Dot's basically only friend. Guy still willing to come to her assistance. Reina had never met Billy Vargas, and if she did, she imagined it wouldn't be under very pleasant circumstances. Still, she did her best to recall all the information she knew about him. Some saw him as a hero from humble roots, but Reina just saw an ordinary man who happened to be born into the right circumstances. He had gone for a strangely similar career path as Reina, though in a far rather different direction. He was from a small village called San Ignacio, not notable for much of anything as far as Reina knew. For most of his life, he had served as a member of the local guard, generally being a peacekeeper and making sure the order was preserved. At some point, he resigned. The exact circumstances as to why is something the Republic wasn't privy to, so Reina wasn't privy to them either. But if you want to be privy to them, go back and watch my playthrough of Malleus Maleficarum. His name drew some scrutiny from those who were particularly paranoid. Reina wasn't one of them. That conspiracy theory was a bit too far-fetched even for her liking. Billy was an especially unusual name in their nation. It was a foreign one, leading to some groundless speculation he had ties to another nation. However, his entire family had resided in the village of San Ignacio for generations. Reina thought it was a poor choice, but they apparently named him after a friend of theirs who was a foreigner. He likely didn't expect them to receive so much trouble over it, but what was done was done. As far as Reina was concerned, anyone who entertained such groundless speculation was fighting an opponent who wasn't there, in favour of battles more worthy of being fought. What was actually important was he had gone on to more or less be the unofficial representative of the reformist faction in the church. The reformers had existed long before Billy Vargas was ever born. As the name implied, he sought to change the structure of the church from within in order to reconcile tradition with modernity. Depending on who you asked, the belief in the gods in the church were either just as genuine as the rest, or a mask of deceit they wore to try and change things while not being as faithful as the other factions within the church. As someone who participated in the witch hunts very frequently, Reina was naturally aligned with the old guard faction, who frequently butted heads with the reformists. Despite that, Reina was actually rather tepid on the reformists, rather than being particularly vitriolic towards them. Why expend her energy on people who were technically her allies when she had other things to worry about? It probably helped that while she naturally aligned with them the most, she didn't particularly feel like she was truly a member of the old guard. And that was more or less the extent of her knowledge of Billy Vargas. She didn't particularly ever feel like digging for more information, in part because so much reliable information was mixed in with hearsay and unverifiable claims. He was known to be a very peaceful man, and his devotion to the church was rarely questioned. His story was completely unrelated to hers, so there was no reason for her to think on it further. If Marta was a more peaceful internal reformist, then maybe... No, she was doing it again. So we have a bit of more knowledge of what Billy was getting up to after the events of Malleus. So, he left his job as a peacekeeper and is now trying to reform from within. And, at the same time, Dot has gone on. And he knows about this, of course. Dot has gone on to become the doting witch and tried the other approach, coming it from two sides, but the same goal. Yeah, we've read this part. She had to stay focused. Do you have anything you want to say to me? Apologies, condemnations, eloquent speeches, incoherent screeds. I'll take anything you want to say. No matter what it is, I'll listen. Reina let go of Marta's neck after what felt like ages. With her left hand, she kept holding Marta by the chin, while with her right, she reached for her knife once again and pointed just a few inches away from her neck. Marta took several quick breaths, hacking and coughing awkwardly. In the midst of her coughing and attempts to regain her voice, Marta let out a few pained, mirthful sounds that half resembled laughter. Marta began speaking, then broke into further coughing. Regardless, Reina waited for her to regain her voice. It was strange. She had a hard time feeling bad about the physical harm she just caused her, but she hated the fact that Marta's voice seemed pained and less beautiful now. They probably said something about her morals, but only the gods could judge her for what they meant now. It's insane. I've always thought I didn't mind if you hurt me, or broke me, or what. As long as it was you, I'd be fine. Marta stopped for a moment and closed her eyes, as if afraid of seeing Reina's reaction to her next words. And now we're here, I can say I was right. I really don't mind. I still can't hate you. As long as it's you. I don't mind being ruined, however you like. I'm really messed up in the head, huh? You really shouldn't say that about yourself. Reina's words rang hollow. They didn't even sound particularly convincing to herself. How she's supposed to scold Marta to better take care of herself when she'd already hurt her, when her mission was to exterminate her and her kin. Still, the words had escaped her lips without being able to put a stop to them. She looked at Marta and thought about how vulnerable people could really be when she would cut off all their options. People were frightening, both in how frail and how durable they could be. She'd seen people power through injuries that should have killed them many times over. She had seen people die the most sudden and pointless deaths. The only way to make sense of it all was to simply not think about it too much. She'd stopped thinking of the corpses she saw as human. Anyone else would surely do the same to her if they stumbled upon her corpse, whether it was a clean corpse or a maimed one. Raina tried to convince herself that she wasn't killing her old childhood friend, someone who had been more than a friend, if she had any honesty to spare herself. No! She was killing a witch who happened to be wearing the skin of her friend. It was better if she simply acted like the Marta she knew had vanished one day. She raised the knife. Marta didn't even flinch, but her eyes were no longer locked on Raina. Instead, she was focused entirely on the knife within Raina's hand. How soon until it brought the end of her life. And still, Raina hesitated. Raina was shaking far more than Marta was. It was like she was the one fast approaching death instead. She managed to spit out a few words, stammering all the while. If you confess all of your sins and work together with the witch hunts, you might not be executed. Re-education is an option. There have been cases like that before. I can vouch for you. What you're asking me to do is inhuman. You might as well just give me the knife and let me end myself right here and now. You have to have realised I'd say something like this, right? Marta's words were sharp, but her tone was a complete mismatch. It was more gentle than Raina would have expected. Soothing, like she was kindly lecturing her about something very obvious. It was obvious, but Raina didn't want to admit it. She had to stop her hands from shaking. She'd nearly dropped the knife, though, with Marta's hands and feet bound as they were. It wasn't like it would have amounted to much. But maybe... No, wait. She shouldn't be hoping that Marta tried to make some sort of escape attempt. Seeing how shaken Raina was, Marta continued speaking, since it was plain as day Raina wasn't going to say anything until she was forced to. Besides, I've seen the posters. I'm more valuable as a corpse. You really think you'd let me try to repent? No. I crossed that line for the church a long while back. Next you're going to ask me to believe in fairy tales. Come on. I'm waiting. I know how this has to end. Raina looked at Marta and wondered if there was any way for her to contest her words. She thought back to the wanted posters she had seen. Every wanted poster specified if a suspected witch or associated with a witch was wanted, dead, alive, or if either one was acceptable. Marta's had been the one that said she was only wanted dead. Even if Raina was to bring her alive to a church official, there would be little point. Raina would be reprimanded for not doing her job properly, and Marta would suffer a terrible death. Being burned at the stake or drowning was common, though Raina had heard some unsavoury rumours about new methods of death among those who weren't satisfied with those options. The thought of Marta dying that way... She stopped herself from thinking about any further about that scenario. Wasn't it better for her to die here then? She'd already said as much. Better to die at Raina's hands than the alternative. It would be kinder, more merciful, painless by comparison. All Raina had to do was bring the knife down. Slowly, the knife in her hand found itself inching closer and closer to Marta's neck. Thank you. For once, Marta's words didn't cause Raina to stop any of her movements. However, she was moving her hand at an agonizingly slow pace. She was clearly, once again, trying to stall the inevitable as much as she could, and only succeeded in making things more difficult for both of them. Maybe this was her way of punishing herself. Relishing the pain would surely lessen her guilt about what she was doing. Better to harm herself now than feel hurt later. There was a wide smile on Marta's face despite the circumstances. It looked far too much like a childhood smirk for Raina's liking. I love you, Raina. I hope the world is a kinder place to you after I'm gone. Those tender words were like the sweetest, foulest, gentlest, harshest poison to Raina's mind. She didn't dare try to fathom what kind of expression she must have been making. All she knew was that it must have been a far uglier one than the serene, accepting one that was on Marta's face. The moment had finally arrived. With just a bit of strength and effort, she could slit Marta's neck and silence her forever. It would be simple. A witch would be slain, and good deed would be done. And yet, she felt like she might once again pause and hesitate. I think this might be the choice. And to say we could go back, I'm gonna hesitate. Her hesitation was almost laughable at this point, but the fact that it kept happening really should have told her something. She moved the knife away from Marta's neck. The utter serenity on Marta's face was replaced by bafflement when she realised what Raina was doing. She truly had been prepared to die. Raina couldn't imagine being so at peace with death, especially in circumstances like this. "That'll do it," Raina whispered, making a few skilled and clean cuts with the knife. She had cut the ropes binding Marta's hands and legs. She was free now. "What the hell are you thinking? Why?" There was less anger and more complete and utter bafflement. Marta didn't even pay attention to how much her limbs ached after being restricted for so long. She stood up and faced Raina, who still had the knife in her hands. She wouldn't meet her eyes no matter how long Marta waited. Finally, Raina just whispered a few words. "I just can't." That was the only justification she had to give her. It wasn't eloquent and made her sound weak. It was all Raina had to offer. Marta had been so prepared for death that she hadn't even considered the possibility she would have to make any sort of decision. She had chosen to accept death. That was supposed to be the end. But it wasn't. And now she had to pick up the pieces and try to figure out what to do with them. Her life being spared meant she had to confront the situation they were in head on. There was still a suspected witch and a church elder who hunted witches. The two couldn't peacefully exist in the same space. They weren't supposed to. Marta knew for a fact that she wasn't capable of witchcraft. She didn't think anyone was, really. It was all propaganda to hunt down and eliminate those the church saw as undesirable in her eyes. A view that was commonly shared, though not often spoken out loud, by many who resisted the witch hunts. "So where does that leave us, then?" Marta asked. Raina seemed simply stunned by the question. No, Marta couldn't tell why. Surely she should have expected it, right? It was strange. Not that she was no longer trapped. Marta could tell that she was still slightly taller than Raina. Wonderfully odd and pointless thing to note during a situation like this, but it did bring to mind many of their past conversations. The teasing they gave each other over their massive height difference when they were kids, only for it to no longer mean anything once Raina hit her growth spurt. Marta could tell that her thoughts were trying to escape to a happier time, trying to make the current situation seem more bearable. So once again, she tried to stop herself from thinking back to the past. There would surely be time for that later. Time she didn't expect to have. Raina held out the knife with the blade pointed away from Marta so as not to confuse her. "Take this knife and end me right now. Do whatever you want after." "You're not seriously asking me to do that, are you?" "I am." Marta stared intently at the knife in Raina's hand. The entire situation had changed far too quickly for her to keep up. She didn't make any movements. She needed some sort of explanation. Something that would make all of this make sense. If such a thing even existed. The knife in Raina's hands, which she was sure would end her life. Now she was supposed to use it to end someone else's. What sort of twisted trick of fate was this? And why did Raina insist on this anyway? Sensing her confusion, Raina began explaining. She sounded surer of herself than she previously had. "I can't be allowed to walk out of this alive. And I can't just pretend like none of this ever happened. Grant me the mercy of death's sweet embrace, Marta. Many witches have cursed me in their dying breaths. Give them the justice they seek. The justice I seek. You have the chance to make things right. It's too late for my regrets to mean anything. But you have a bright future ahead of you. End me, and live the happy life you deserve, that I try to deny you. I'm certain the group you're a part of would question your loyalty if they found you escaped from me, without taking my life." She paused, taking a deep breath, then continued speaking her honest thoughts. "Besides, I'm certain the church will question my loyalty if they ever find out I'll let you go. I wouldn't be able to keep this in a secret. I'm a poor liar and an even poorer actress. There's no telling what would happen to me once they learn the truth. It would be better if you ended my life. Believe me." Marta could feel her heart pounding violently. The entire situation seemed utterly surreal. She hated the fact that Raina's words made a strange amount of sense to her. Clearly there was something wrong with both of them. She needed to make a decision soon. Raina was still waiting and looking at her expectantly. Two different courses of action crossed her mind. Of course, she could simply take the knife and do as Raina asked. However, she was certain if she did it suddenly enough, She could knock the knife away from Raina's hand before she even realised what was happening. Marta was surprised at just how fast she was at knocking away the knife. While Raina was clearly expected to take the knife, Marta slapped her hand and sent the knife flying to some distant corner of the cabin. It was a rather small enclosed space, so she was certain it couldn't have gone far, but the point was to never remove it from the picture entirely. "What are you thinking?" Raina asked her voice low and almost threatening. Marta got the feeling that none of the malice was directed at her specifically. Marta shook her head and took a cautious step towards Raina. She held up her hands to make herself seem as non-threatening as possible. She wasn't sure how effective it was, but what it was felt natural. She didn't have to think very hard for her response. "What are you thinking? Neither of us are going to die here today. I never thought I'd get a chance like this again. I have to make things right. That is, if you're willing to meet me halfway." "You're serious about this, aren't you? You really think we can just pretend like nothing happened and go back to our lives?" Raina sounded furious. Again, not at Marta. Despite how long it had been, Marta could tell when she was angry at a specific person, when she was angry at something more abstract than that. But of course, Marta had to correct her on something. If she didn't do it now, she wasn't sure she would ever get the chance to. And she was tired of living with regrets. "I'm not asking that we pretend that none of this happened. I don't want us to be apart anymore. Or are you telling me I'm the only one who still feels this way?" "That's an unfair question, you know." Raina sighed deeply. She sounded less angry now, but all her fury was replaced with utter exhaustion. Raina leaned against one of the cabin's walls and allowed herself to slide down so that she was sitting on the wooden floor. It was as if all her strength had simply given out all at once, and she could no longer bear the idea of standing up. Despite not quite understanding what she was up to, Marta decided to sit down next to her. She decided to give her some space and not sit too close. But contrary to Marta's expectations, Raina moved closer to her. As soon as she saw what she was doing, she didn't comment on her move at all, so Marta decided not to make any comments about it either. She sat there in silence for a long while. She wasn't sure how it happened, but at some point, Marta had ended up leaning on Raina's shoulder. She didn't resist, but was oddly peaceful and relaxing despite how tense things had been just a short while ago. If they could just stay like that forever, then it would be perfect. But a daydream could only last for so long, and they had to address heavier topics that they wished they could stay away from. Raina broke the silence after a short while. I thought I could stop caring about you this way, if I just tried hard enough. We don't have our youth as an excuse anymore. I can't pretend that what I feel is just something I've already cut off, because I've tried that, and it doesn't work. No matter how hard I try to become a less sinful person, I can never manage it. So she was still on about that. I decided she just couldn't just listen and wait. She didn't want to risk an argument, but she wanted to get Raina on the same page as her. If the way I feel about you, if the way I assume you feel about me, if any of that is sinful, then I guess I'll just drown in sin, happily and gladly. It would make me happy if you walked down this path with me, despite everything. Raina was silent for a while. Marta realised these sort of long pauses would probably be common with her. Actually, they'd always been common. Raina was a very thoughtful person, and as to say she'd have an extremely bad habit of overthinking things, to the point that some might think she thought things over too slowly. But Marta knew her better than that. Raina was the type whose thoughts raced a mile a minute, and then overthought until she exhausted herself and exhausted her feelings. It'd always been true. Marta, I need you to realise something. I'm an awful, miserable shell of a human being. If you have any fond memories of me, then you should keep your memory of who I was alive and forget who I am now. You'll only be disappointed otherwise. The look on Marta's face when he said that could be best described as being perplexed. So Raina decided she needed to elaborate. Even if she didn't want to, Marta said the whole truth and to know all the ugly emotions that were contained within her. I don't see what there is to be confused about. I've slain many innocent people in the names of the witch hunts. Maybe that's what's confusing you. It would be simpler if I really believed I was fighting evil when I killed so-called witches. But despite what you think, I don't actually agree they have this kind of demonic magic that others would have you believe. Well, I used to be a believer, but I stopped once I saw more and more of them. If they had the sort of power, one would think there'd be clear evidence of it. That just means I've committed evil while being aware of it. Instead of being misguided, if I were being a misguided fool, then there'd at least be some hope for me. She thought that was enough, but Marta waited for it to continue, so she did. I thought if I kept my faith in the church and participated in the witch hunts, it would erase all the doubts in my heart. And my attempts to dissuade you of my guilt only made things worse. I'm the worst sort of hypocrite. I don't deserve any sort of happiness, Marta. Genuinely, I don't. And who says you don't deserve happiness exactly? Marta shot back. After how long Raina had talked for, it was a bit too simple of a response. Even Marta was aware of that, but she couldn't think of anything more eloquent in the moment. Besides, she really didn't want Raina's thoughts to spiral and take a turn for the worse. She waited too much time thinking of a better response, and so she went with a simple, blunt approach. I'm going to show you something, Raina said, and without waiting for any kind of response, she removed one of her gloves. Marta remembered how beautiful Raina's hands were. Beautiful, lovely hands that were perfectly at home on the piano. A far cry from her own rough and dirty with the telltale signs of being used for farm work. Raina's hands were covered in scars. It generally seemed that they were more scarred than tissue. They were mangled beyond belief. Raina, what happened? Does this have anything to do with how you end up as a soldier for the church? As soon as Marta asked the question, Raina shook her hand vigorously. She wanted to set the record straight. These are self-inflicted, Marta. Raina pointed towards the opposite corner of the room they were in, and that was when Marta saw it. The knife Raina had wielded against her once, a knife she had tossed aside and forgotten as if it were mere trash. It's a very long story, Marta. I don't care to go into the specifics of it. You'll surely think worse of me for it. Worse than you already will anyway. These wounds are my cross to bear. Every day that I was consumed by sinful thoughts, I took that blade to my own skin and, well, you can imagine. I thought that doing that would cut off the sin within me. As you can tell, it wasn't very successful. Raina laughed, but it was a sort of dark chuckle that Marta didn't really like hearing. It was nothing like this genuine, pure laughter that she knew she was capable of. Just look at my hands. They're awful now, don't you think? You wouldn't imagine a pianist with hands like these, I'm sure. I haven't even touched the piano in ages. I didn't think I deserved to after everything. Falling in love with another woman. If you truly wish to venture down that path, you should be with a better woman than me. At least. Marta didn't respond with words. Instead, she took Raina's hand in her own. Gently, she placed her lips on Raina's hand and gave it a kiss. I still think your hands are beautiful. You're serious, aren't you? You really are. I don't even know how to respond to that. Despite herself, Raina couldn't help but smile. She thought that she didn't deserve to smile any longer, but what Marta had done was just so unexpected and so quintessentially herself that she couldn't stop, even though she didn't think it was appropriate. But she still had more to say. However, Marta was prepared to respond no matter what she threw at her. Like I said, I'm an awful person. Using the church as my shield. I've killed many people and committed so many atrocities. I don't deserve happiness. The gods will damn me. Only the most miserable fate is worthy of people like me. The gods might not forgive you, but that doesn't matter. I think you deserve to be happy. I want you to be happy. Guess that makes me a pretty rotten person too, huh? How are we going to make this work? I can't go back to the church, but your allies will be happy to see me either. You should forget about me. As long as it's with you, I don't mind just running off to some distant corner of the world together. We can figure things out. I have connections. We can start by leaving the country. And you think things will be easier somewhere else? It could be worse. This is a mistake. My life is full of mistakes. What's one more? If things don't work out, then at least I'll have tried. Just a short while ago, I nearly strangled you. I can still see the marks on your neck. I'll ruin you. I don't mind. Ruin me if you like. You're hopeless, you know that? Yeah, I know. Stay with me and make sure I don't make too much of a mess, will you? What she was suggesting was irresponsible and dangerous. Even if Marta really did have these connections, she claimed she did. Rena knew very little about the rest of the world. The country had always been fairly isolated. For all she knew, the witch hunts could be even worse elsewhere. And she wasn't comfortable with the idea of asking Mars to just completely give up on her life here, just for a chance at something. It wasn't even a chance at something better. Rena knew that she couldn't guarantee her happiness. Why did Marta have to fall for her, of all people? Why couldn't she have been childhood friends with anyone else who would have been more worthy of her? Marta, you're forgetting something really important. We have our own positions. Me with the church and you with the rebels. You really expect both of us to just abandon all that? This time it was Marta's turn to laugh. You know what she was about to say was kind of mad, but she had made the decision now. We could just be two people who went missing in action during that prison break. Two more unaccounted for to add to the lists on both sides. Why not pretend to be a corpse? Better than being a real one anyway. Finally, it really dawned on Rena that Marta wasn't going to back down from this. And she didn't want her to back down. Her heart eagerly jumped at the chance to try and escape and be happy with her. Damn the consequences. Maybe the two had never grown up for the children they once were. You're hopeless. You already said that. I know. Here, let me shut you up. Marta pressed her lips against Rena's. Rena froze for just a moment, but then she wrapped her arms around her and just let it happen. Eventually the kiss stopped and Rena let go. It had been rather brief and fairly chaste, all things considered. The two stared at each other for a while, both very conscious of the blushes on each other's faces. This really wasn't the times we had in like young girls with crushes, but then again, they never had the chance to be in the past. Maybe they were just making it for lost time, even if it seemed ridiculous now that they were young women. Rena took a deep breath, thinking things over. Marta, can I say something? Yeah, what is it? Marta replied, tilting her head. She was clearly lost in her own little world. You're an awful kisser, you know that. Seriously, that was clumsy. On first kiss is supposed to be more romantic than that. That's what you have to say? Seriously? I've really tried my hardest, you know. What the hell is wrong with you? What the hell is wrong with me? It's not like I practiced this or anything. Despite everything, Marta couldn't help but laugh at how randomly caustic Rena's comment had been. She could tell it wasn't a comment made out of disgust. It was somehow full of all her affection, in only the way Rena could express. Rena let out a short laugh. It only lasted for a few precious, brief moments, but it sounded much more like the laugh that Marta had been used to hearing from her. I guess you'll have to get better with practice then. So wait, does that mean... Marta didn't finish her sentence when Rena interrupted her. Come on, use your head. Isn't it obvious? I'm prepared to embark on this fool's journey with you, wherever it leads. For far too long I've looked at my reflection and thought that I wanted to kill the creature that stared back at me. But if you're willing to deal with all that, I guess I should give her the chance to be happy. They really were going to do this then. There was no backing out of it now. Whatever future awaited them, they would face it together. I'm going to take this with me, at least for a little while, Marta said. She stood up, then stretched her arms a bit before walking over to the corner of the cabin. Rena didn't have to ask what she was doing. There was only one thing she could be looking for. Marta picked up the knife. Rena flinched and looked away from it. I hate this thing. One day, you're going to watch me completely destroy it. Rena looked utterly confused. It was a poor response compared to how full of conviction Marta seemed to be. Seeing her confusion, Marta decided an explanation was in order. It reminds you of other times you used it, right? So I'll get rid of it as soon as we reach the merchant and get a different knife. I'm not asking you to forget what you used it for, to pretend that you don't ever feel the way you did before about yourself. But I do want to be by your side and watch you learn to hate yourself a little less, day by day. Don't care how unreasonable that is. You're stuck with me, remember? It was the most loving and gentle reprimand that Rena could ever recall receiving. Yeah, I guess I am. And you're stuck with me, like it or not. Marta smiled at Rena's response. Rena decided it was time for her to get up as well. They were about to embark on the journey soon, after all, strange as it seemed for her to imagine. But before they left, Marta had one more request. Hey, I know this isn't the time for it, but one day I'd love to hear you play the piano again. It doesn't have to be soon. It can be years from now. But I want to hear it. Rena looked down at her hands as Marta spoke, prompting Marta to shake her head. Don't care what you have to say. Every part of you is beautiful to me. If you disagree, then I guess I've got poor taste. Rena couldn't help but agree with that last part. You really do have awful taste. But that's fine. I'll do it one day. Sing along when I do, will you? She could still remember when they were children and they practiced music together. Well, practiced. Raina was a trained musician, while Marta was a very unskilled singer who only ever sang just for fun in order to accompany Raina. She had a beautiful voice, but her lack of actual training meant that her singing had numerous imperfections. The two had always been very mismatched. And Marta made that abundantly clear. Now who's got awful taste? I'm a terrible singer, you know, but alright, it's a deal. Once again, Marta took Raina's hand in hers and gave it a gentle kiss. The two stepped out of the cabin together and into the outside world. They were in a forest now, but soon they would leave it and go who knows where, doing who knows what. They stumbled towards an uneasy, uncertain future together, hand in hand. Their happiness together wasn't guaranteed. Considering all they were giving up, there was every possibility they would live to consider this mistake. Surely many people had been in a position just like theirs, willing to give up everything for the sake of an uncertain and hazy future. But it was a decision they'd made together. They would chase after that uncertain, ordinary happiness that they had craved. And so they vanished from the pages of history. And so we've reached the end of our tale, or at least an ending. Thank you so much for reading so far. I hope you enjoyed your time with the story. Well, I very much did, and I hope you, the viewer, did as well. I tried my best to make that reading as dramatic as I possibly could. There are 3 endings in this story. Please click here if you'd like to go back to the first branching point, which should make the convenience to your 3 endings. It's highly recommended that you read all 3 endings before viewing the author's notes. That said, if you're satisfied with the ending you read and don't feel like going back for the others, then feel free to proceed. No, we will be doing the other endings actually. And here are the list of credits and the author's notes. Whether you choose to read the author's notes or not, thank you very much for reading Quiero, Matarte. I've written many stories before, but this is my first publicly released story in Twine. Here's hoping the rough edges aren't too distracting and it was still fun to read despite this sort of being a learning experience for me. Take care and have a nice day. Well, this was a very good reading experience, but we're going to continue it by slitting Marta's neck. Her indecision had thus far only brought her further pain and misery. All of this would have been over if she had just finished things from the start rather than try and capture Marta for no real purpose. She wouldn't be left with further regrets the longer this went on, but at least she could cut her losses and end her regrets here. Raina couldn't free herself of all her doubts. Numerous what-ifs dominated her mind even as she tried to steal her convictions, but she could at least shake them off long enough to do what had to be done. A knife found Marta's neck and ended her life in an instant. It wasn't the first time Raina had taken someone else's life, but it was the first time that she had done so while they had no chance to fight back. A rush of adrenaline and convenient excuses could assuage her guilty conscience whenever she slew someone in the heat of battle. There was no such remedy when they were completely defenceless. Even without considering the specific circumstances, Marta deserved better than to die in some makeshift shack created as a poor man's jail cell, and yet Raina had seen fit to grant her that fate regardless. Raina knelt down and cradled Marta's body. She wondered how long it would be before she stopped resembling herself. How long before she looked just like any other corpse and lost all trace of who she once was. She couldn't bear the thought of Marta decaying away into nothingness, but she couldn't bear the thought of just burying her either. Any thoughts of preserving her body felt like the desperate delusions of a madwoman. Just what would the church say if she insisted on trying to preserve the corpse of a suspected witch? She should have the strength to follow through with what needed to be done, after killing someone so near and dear to her heart. Instead of summoning up any hidden reserves of courage, she found only cowardice. Raina lifted up Marta's face and moved her lips closer to hers. She placed a kiss on her lips, the first and last. What she was doing was disgusting. It repulsed her. Anyone who knew what she was doing would consider what she was doing absolutely abhorrent. Even if no one else was there to see her sin, the gods and herself would judge her forever for it. And yet she considered it a lesser sin compared to the alternative. She was kissing a corpse, not a person. This was not the sin of homosexuality. She had convinced herself that her crime was lesser as a result, without caring about how persuasive it was or wasn't. She certainly wasn't succeeding at convincing herself, at any rate. She was little more than the beast who wanted to indulge in sin and tried to look for any convenient excuse. That moment didn't last long. It was thoroughly unpleasant as she knew it would be, and yet some twisted part of herself didn't regret doing it anyway. I can't go to the church, have you? There's only one person who those words could have come from, but Raina scarcely believed that she was the one saying them. felt like she completely lost control over her own thoughts and feelings. She looked at the cut on Marta's neck. All things considered, this would be classified as a rather clean killing. As clean as killing could be, anyway. Standard procedure for witches who were wanted dead was to either carry them in a body bag to the nearest church, or dispose of the body in some way while keeping some identifiable part preserved and presenting that as proof. Neither felt possible to do for Raina. Neither idea felt right. She just hated the idea of what the church might do to her corpse. She just hated the idea of Marta rotting away like she was any other corpse. All Raina could do was take responsibility and ruin her herself. The knife that she had used to end Marta's life wasn't the best tool at her disposal for the job. She usually carried a sword with her, but she had lost it at some point during the same night she encountered Marta again. All she had left with her was that knife. The knife that had brought her so much pain and suffering in the past, and with it, she could finally cut away all of her feelings. By cutting them away, she could give some sort of meaning to what she had done. She gazed at Marta's corpse, and like before, she was no longer shaking. Her bravery had chosen a fine time to make herself known. She took the knife in her hand and began cutting away at Marta's body. She cut and cut and cut like a woman possessed by some sort of vengeful spirit. She didn't particularly care about how messy the process was, or that her chosen method was woefully inefficient. The inefficiency was in the point away. Raina tore and cut with all her strength until Marta no longer resembled the beautiful person she had been once, until the bits and pieces of her became objects rather than parts of a person. She cut and cut and cut. The action of swinging the knife's blade around soon grew routine and mechanical. Her thrusts and slashes were very rough and messy, but in her state of mind she thought they were precise and clean. Clean. Again, there was that word. It was the furthest thing she would associate with death. She didn't know how to measure how much time had passed. All that she knew was that by the time she was done, her entire body felt sore and exhausted. Only when there was no trace of the one Marta once was, could she bring herself to stop. Covered in blood and guts, with the foul stench of death in the room around her, Raina knelt down and began praying. What she prayed for was anyone's guess. She felt something warm and hot gushing down her cheeks, wiping away some of the blood. She chose to ignore it. After finishing her prayers, Raina would provide Marta with a makeshift burial of sorts. Really, it was a poor excuse for a burial. Barely qualified as such. She gathered all the parts of the woman she had loved and stuffed them in a body bag. Then she began the process of digging a hole in the ground. Thankfully, the area that Raina had chosen for her makeshift holding cell was one that was a fair distance away from the nearest village, close to a forest. Ordinarily, it wasn't too far away from a major prison, but as of the previous night, that prison no longer existed. Just as Marta no longer existed. And just as the woman named Raina, who had loved and treasured Marta, had no right to exist anymore, all she could do was offer up her body in service to the church and continue hunting witches as efficiently as she could. Before long, she buried Marta and walked away. When Raina arrived at the nearest village, her appearance caused an uproar. She hadn't bothered cleaning herself up. The blood remained uncleaned, and those who saw her before she was brought to the nearest church, she could have easily been mistaken for something not of this world. However, this uproar would be little more than a footnote for Raina. History would note that she spent a small amount of time in a near catatonic state, guarded close by whatever guard force the village could muster. However, upon the arrival of the church official, her status as a soldier was verified, and Raina told the tale of how she battled the witch sympathizers who had broken into one of the biggest prisons in her nation. It was strange how quickly things went back to normal for Raina. It was as if that day with Marta had never happened. On that day, Raina buried a part of herself deep into the recesses of her heart, where she would never find it again. Official records would note that Raina redoubled her efforts in the mission she was on, frequently praised for her loyalty to the church and for her faith. However, it was noted that her expression from then on was an unwavering one. No matter what situation she was in or who she spoke to, she always responded in a cool, detached manner. Her popularity among her comrades as a potential friend dwindled, but the respect for her devotion to the witch hunts grew. She became known as a soldier you would respect and be glad to have by your side, but not one you could ever get close to. She would never allow anyone who would try to get close to her get very far. Raina would remain a soldier until her retirement of old age. though her devotion to the church never waned even for a moment. She took on a role as an instructor of a small village's church, teaching both good morals and basic survival skills to all who were interested. She would pass away of old age while the world at large continued to struggle with the witch hunts. She never married or had any children. On her deathbed, perhaps she thought about whether her efforts meant anything or not, when the resistance to the witch hunt seemed to only grow fiercer and more fervent with time. But that no longer concerned her. The history books have much to say about her, but she wouldn't be there to listen to it. And she wouldn't be there to defend or justify herself. And now is the tale of Raina, a poor musician who thought through a strange trick of fate, found herself as a soldier and loyal to the church's old god, who fervently supported the witch hunts. Any regrets or lingering thoughts she had died with her, unvoiced and buried deep within her heart. That is another ending. I think we can all agree it's best to pretend that ending never happened. But that said, there is one more ending for us to see. We have to pause and hesitate. We have to keep going from here. We have to take the knife and do as Raina asked. I'm wondering which of these two endings will be worse. Wordlessly, Marta took the knife in her hands. As soon as her hands were free, Raina clasped her hands together in silent prayer. She closed her eyes and waited for what had to happen next. Marta wondered if Raina would stay still and pray forever if she was given the chance. What if Marta simply walked up the cabin and left? Would Raina continue praying? Of course, walking out on her wasn't an option. Marta knew what she had to do, and it wasn't something she could just put off. She looked at the knife in her hands, and that it was in her hands and not Raina's. She could tell it was actually made for a rather inefficient weapon. She was familiar with the weapons that the church soldiers usually arm themselves with. The others they carried were basically meant for any scenario where their movement was limited. Tight corridors and hallways where a swing of the sword would be impeded, or if they were disarmed in some way and needed a last resort. The knife was also a multi-use tool that could be used for various practical purposes if the situation called for it. It was just a handle and a small blade when you broke it down. Marta could tell that this particular knife had seen a great deal of use. It must have been repaired countless times. She had to wonder why Raina hadn't seen fit to replace it, considering the rough condition it was in. Surely, the church had the funds to provide replacements even if she requested them. Still, even a knife in poor condition like that could still do what was necessary. Marta took a deep breath. She embraced Raina while placing her lips against hers. One of Marta's arms hugged Raina tightly while the other wielded the knife and thrust it into Raina's chest. When Raina's eyes opened in shock, Marta wasn't sure whether the kiss and the knife had provoked it. It was the first time they each had a kiss. It was the first time Marta had ever taken another life. Raina closed her eyes once more as death approached her. Marta gently laid her down on the makeshift bed in the cabin. She placed the knife next to Raina and then turned round. For a brief moment, she exited the cabin through the door, and it well and truly seemed she was going to leave it at that. But she just needed to do something very quickly. Outside, she was surrounded by the forest. She had no idea of the exact location where she was, but she did know the forest located in the prison where the operation had taken place. She was certain it must have been around there where they were located, but none of that mattered. All Marta wanted to do was find a secluded place and throw up. She felt nauseous. Disgustingly nauseous. She wondered if this was how Raina felt when she first took a life. Many of the rebels who opposed the witches' hunts were commonly viewed as extremely violent and unable to be tamed. Vicious beasts who opposed the natural order. And in truth, many were ready to fight and kill if it meant freeing the oppressed. But Marta had never been that sort of person. She'd always been a pacifist, as much of a pacifist as she could afford to be, with her role anyway. It was a bit of a lie she fed herself in truth. Many of her closest comrades were more than willing to rain death upon the church's soldiers if they needed to, and often Marta would be right by the side to provide a distraction or to slow down any soldiers. Her role was that of an information gatherer and scout, not a direct combatant. She hadn't kept track of how many people had died after she distracted them, and given one of her comrades a prime opportunity to strike. Surely she was an accomplice to many deaths, the full extent of which she would never comprehend. But still, this was different. She had killed the woman she had loved directly. Perhaps it was a kindness, or perhaps it was a cruelty. Either way, her body seemed to reject everything she had just done. I never wanted this. When Marta finished vomiting, she walked back to the log cabin. She wondered if there was a story behind it. Did Raina build it herself? Just how often had she used it? How many people had died in it? These were questions she could no longer ask Raina. Even if she were alive, surely there'll be far more pressing concerns in their minds. I've got to meet up with the others soon, or they'll think I got killed off. But I can't just leave you like this. You deserve better than that. Outside the cabin, Marta had spotted a shovel. It must have been Raina's. Surely she'd used it to bury many supposed witches in the past. Innocent people, as far as Marta was concerned. Maybe they were surrounded by unmarked graves. And now Raina would be joining them. Marta didn't know how much about preparing a grave. Well, that wasn't entirely true. As a farmhand, she prepared graves for animals before, but never people. She wanted to at least do something, even if it was more for her own comfort. So she set about digging into the ground in order to find a resting place for Raina. It would only be right. Surely Raina would have done the same for her as well. Absent-mindedly, Marta reached for her own lips and thought back to the kiss they had shared during Raina's final moments. In a kinder world, perhaps they could have shared so many more. Marta felt like she'd always been a horribly selfish sort of person. She saw the church's soldiers who aided in the persecution of witches as more or less evil people whose deaths shouldn't be mourned. But Raina had always been an exception in her mind. No matter how many injustices Raina was responsible for, Marta could never hate her. She would always love her, no matter how many sins she was responsible for. It was her curse. It was the strength and weakness of love. Surely those other soldiers whose lives she had wrote off had people who felt similarly about them. At least a few of them must have. Just how many people had their own Raina within the church who was unceremoniously slain? Wondered by not seeing them as actual people. And could Marta make sense of their deaths? She didn't want to think about the great evils the people who had loved and were loved could commit. She shook her head, trying to let such morose thoughts take over her being. She just wanted closure. And before long, she carried Raina's body to the makeshift grave she had dug and buried it the best she could. Rest in peace, Raina. Watch over me, will you? I've still got to fight to help win. Even if we were on opposing sides, you'd root for me now, right? Marta would make her way through the forest with a cold determination in her eyes. She had plenty of survivalist experience and was determined not to die an utterly pointless death after what had just transpired. She was prepared to call upon all of her outdoor wilderness experience, which proved to be an utterly pointless thought. She had almost laughed when she realised. Raina had built the log cabin fairly close to the nearby village, so the fight for survival that Marta imagined might happen in that forest never actually transpired. She was genuinely shocked at how quickly she found other signs of human life. She couldn't tell if the world was doing her a kindness or laughing at her. It was a reminder that life had continued for other people, even though it felt like only her and Raina mattered. The cat is getting quite close to the mic, so I have to hold him. Posing as a lost and confused traveller, she was able to acquire the information that she needed to get some food and directions to the nearest town that she recognised. Before long, she'll be able to rejoin with her comrades and continue her fight. Thankfully, when Marta met up with her comrades, she didn't exactly need to explain why she disappeared during the prison break. Many of her comrades had scattered and were chased by enemy soldiers. Everyone's eyes, Marta simply took a bit longer to come out of hiding and rejoin the group. Despite how bloody the operation was, her comrades seemed to consider the prison break operation a major success and inspired not only them but other groups who were protesting the witch hunts. It showed the church in a moment of weakness, and in particular made the old guard seem weak. Perhaps it was just the idealism talking, but perhaps it would make public support of the old guard drop in favour of the other branches of the church, who are more tolerant of supposed witches. But while it felt like a major event, Marta knew that change didn't happen overnight. The battle she fought was a long one, but she wasn't so delusional as to believe that witch hunts would simply stop all at once, and so some time passed. As she suspected, the world wasn't so easily freed of all its injustices, but Marta would be noted as a major member of the Doting Witches' rebel forces, who played a key role in freeing many accused witches. While the history books wouldn't focus much on the individual members of the rebellion, instead treating them as a sort of unified group, Rather than the mess of clashing thoughts and personalities he truly were, Wise would have a few things noted down about her life, especially her later years. This would have little to do with her life as a rebel. It was such as she worked as an information gatherer until she retired of old age. She never married or had children. She would write and publish a single book under an alias, with her true identity being revealed only posthumously. Rather than her efforts to fight the witch hunts, this book would be her lasting legacy throughout history. It far eclipsed her role as a member of the rebel forces. This book was about a songstress and a farm girl falling in love in an idyllic world. In the author's notes found at the end of the book, Moss was very open about it being based on her real life, though she refused to elaborate on the specific details. She didn't think about the book as being a biography or fiction. Instead, she called the book a happy dream of sorts. It felt the most fitting term. One day she was sure that justice would prevail and the witch hunts would finally be stopped. She had to believe that in order for her efforts to feel like they meant something, if not in her time, then surely the generation after hers, or perhaps the one after that. But her story would come to a close. Well, that was a little bit better than I think you can agree that a little bit better than the ending where Marta's killed. But still, we're going to pretend that never happened, and we're going to pretend that the only true ending is the one where they get to go off together. Because, you know, in hindsight, it probably would have been better if I left that till last then, but we've seen all the endings now, so we're all good with that. Can you take a look at the credits? So this was written, created by, of course, GuardianDreamer. Created an entry for the Smoochy Jam competition, hosted by Lapin Lunaire Games, Autumn Chun, and Mano Namora. Thank you to the hosts and all fellow entrants. Got loved ones. Well, not a direct inspiration for this work specifically. It's set in the same world as another one of my works, The Witch of San Ignacio. I would like to credit The Heart of Thomas, but I'm a cheerleader, and the life and suffering of Sebrante for being primary inspirations for that work. Within this work, Sebrante is notable since I took the name of the Old Guard faction from it. Without them, I wouldn't have created The Witch of San Ignacio, and I wouldn't have created Quiero Matarte either. Thank you to the unhealthy amounts of Arizona iced tea and Boss coffee I consume while writing this. Thank you very much for reading. I really hope you got something out of the experience. Here's my quick way to make something entwine again in the future. And again, yeah, I hope you enjoyed my reading of it, viewer. And I enjoyed reading it very much. We're going to take a look at the author's notes now. Hello, welcome to the author's notes. I'm GuardianDreamer, any/although most people just shorten that to GD. Whether this is your first time reading one of my stories or if you're acquainted with my writing elsewhere, thank you very much for reading Quiero Matarte. I want to talk a bit about the creation of Quiero Matarte, my process writing it, and what inspired it. Before I talk about this work though, I kind of need to talk a bit about the work I created in the same setting. I don't expect most people reading this to have read it since it's on an entirely different engine. Well, I mean, myself and probably anyone who's coming to this, watching this after watching my playthrough or haven't played it themselves, won't have this problem, but we'll read this summary anyway. Malleus Maleficarum, The Witch of San Ignacio, was a work that I wrote on the Ace Attorney Online editor, published in 2022. For those not familiar with Ace Attorney Online, which I imagine there's many people reading this, it's a fan game creation tool based on the Ace Attorney series, which I've used to write several stories. While meant as a tool to create Ace Attorney fan games, almost none of my stories on it are related to Ace Attorney in any way, with one exception, and even that is very heavily based on an alternate universe of Ace Attorney. Well, maybe we'll get around to playing whichever one that's talking about when we play more GuardianDreamer cases in the future, which we definitely will. I've got some other ones lined up first though, but there is one GuardianDreamer case on my current list that I want to get around to playing because I've heard good things about it, like how I was hearing about, mainly on the Discord, Malleus being brought up a lot, and that's why I was like, well, I might as well play this then. Instead, I use the Ace Attorney setup to create what I like to affectionately call my soap opera stories, where I write my characters going through a lot of emotions. Many of my stories do still have Ace Attorney gameplay, but it's not really the focus, and there have been a couple of stories I've written on there that are basically just visual novels without Ace Attorney gameplay. I just haven't to use that engine for. And as for Malleus itself, if you haven't watched me play it or haven't played it yourself, it is a witch trial, but the actual case logic is quite easy. It takes a backseat compared to the story, which is very well written, in my opinion. There are quite a few references to the Witch of San Ignacio in Quiero Matarte, but I wanted to make sure that Quiero Matarte could be understood on its own, since it primarily focuses on Marta and Reina, who are entirely new characters for the story. I hope I succeeded while also hinting at a larger world. For those curious, I'll give a basic summary of Malleus here. We can have a little recap then. Malleus Maleficarum, The Witch of San Ignacio, is a story I made for a horror-themed competition, set in alternate history. So this is... I forgot the name of it actually, but case competitions are a common occurrence on Ace Attorney Online. There's always one going on, so if you want to join in, I highly recommend it, because joining my first one, I managed to come in joint second place, and it was an idea that I'd had for a while. My case dream of a better turnabout, my first case, and I somehow, with almost no experience of using anything like that before, managed to pull off something that I'm still quite proud of it, but I do hope to go back to it one day and fix it up, remaster it if you will, because there are still things now that I've been working on Dark Age Saga and played so many other people's cases that I would change about it. Not for the time being now, while we still need to make the rest of Dark Age Saga. Anyway, keep losing my not to by getting distracted. I kept the exact year and setting intentionally vague, but it was meant to vaguely be a sort of alternate history El Salvador, because that's where my family is from, and vaguely take place when historic witch hunts were happening, which is a period of many years, hence the vagueness. There are some very clear signs for being set in an alternate history, notably the presence of a very high-ranking female bishop as part of its main cast, which is, not something that would happen, though for the most part is sort of like reality unless noted otherwise. This was basically my take on a witch trial, intentionally using the 8th format to set up a trial that felt intentionally frustrating and lacking traditional catharsis in a lot of ways. Ace Attorney is known for its big turnabout moments and being very over the top. The Witch of San Ignacio, like a lot of my AA-based works, is very intentionally fond of anticlimax and is much more subdued, even more than I would usually go for as part of the plot. I love it when things don't happen. I mean, usually I like my climaxes, but it's very well written, so I still like it. Good writing trumps everything. Oh, the cat is getting a bit grumpy, but I need to keep him away from the mic. The story stars Dorotea Alvarez, more commonly known as Dot, a hunter-gatherer residing in a village called San Ignacio, who one day suddenly wakes up to find out that someone who happens to share their exact appearance was found dead. Still didn't get an explanation for that. And both Dot and this mysterious lookalike are both being accused of witchcraft, and in addition, Dot is accused of murdering their mystery lookalike. Dot generally has no idea who the mysterious lookalike is, but they're forced to defend themselves in court anyway. They have one ally, a local guard named Billy Vargas, while everyone else in the cast low-key wants to see them be convicted of witchcraft and die. As the trial goes on, it becomes abundantly clear why this is the case. Dot is basically treated as an other in San Ignacio. They're assigned female at birth, but dressed in masculine clothing, or are often accused of acting tomboyish, which is quite topical to stuff that's going on here in the UK at the moment, unfortunately. Dot is also suspected of being a foreign spy due to them having a very mysterious past which they don't remember, though they've lived in San Ignacio for most of their life. This was a story I wrote that was meant to be quite bleak, but also hopeful in a way, as Dot goes from assigned to their fate all the way to being very resistant and fighting tooth and nail, not to be sent to their death. The Witch of San Ignacio is a story I've received criticism for in the past, and how blunt it is and how awful bigotry is, particularly bigotry towards non-binary and gender non-conforming people. While there are some aspects of it I'd probably do differently now. I'd probably keep the lack of subtlety. I mean, bigotry is, especially nowadays, in recent years, especially on the internet, very rarely is it not blunt. So it's a fairly accurate portrayal. Especially, this was a much more, um, this was a time where it was much more accepted in history, but we're sort of moving back. We're sort of regressing as a society in the sense that it's becoming a lot more blunt now to just sort of hate entire groups, um, and not just judge people based on individual characteristics, which is an ideal I personally aspire to. There are some elements from The Witch of San Ignacio that are mentioned in Quiero, Matarte, most notably the doting witch, Billy Vargas, and Esperanza Guerrero are all characters from The Witch of San Ignacio who I decided I could mention in the story without it being too jarring. There are also some thematic parallels, but for the most part I just wanted to tell a new story with the same setting. Enter Quiero Matarte. Sort of. About a year after creating The Witch of San Ignacio, I thought of another story that I might possibly write taking place in the same setting, titled Quiero Matarte. This version of Quiero Matarte was quite different from the final version you read here. It would have still focused on the relationship between two estranged childhood friends, but the format would be very different. The main character, who would probably have been equivalent to Martin in the story, would start off the story failing to defend themselves in a witch trial after being betrayed by their former best friend, the equivalent of Raina. At the time, my idea for the protagonist would have to be someone who was written to be very passive and who wanted to die, to the point that they wouldn't fight the witchcraft accusations. This makes them very different from Martin in a lot of ways. My thought process was for them to basically have a protagonist who was the exact opposite of Dot from The Witch of San Ignacio. That's quite interesting. So, does that mean the original version was going to be Trial? And Ace Attorney Online? This version of Quiero Matarte would have had the protagonist be kept in a prison that was broken into, and then they would escape but be hunted down by their former best friend, who they had deeply repressed feelings for. Interesting. So, depending on the player's choices, this confrontation would end in one or the other's death, with the ending where the protagonist dies being far easier to get. There was no third ending where both lived. The one where the protagonist lived would simply have been the more optimistic of the two. By the way, it was meant to be a deeply tragic tale. I originally wanted to write this version of Quiero Matarte in the Ace Attorney Online editor, but I quickly grew discouraged from this endeavour. The inspiration ideas just weren't coming together, and I had a lot of other stories I wanted to write. Many blobbers and story ideas competing in my head at all times. Tell me about it. I decided to just shelve the story idea, laid dormant for a very long while. Kind of wish we could have seen what it would be like on Ace Attorney Online, and I do hope we can see more stories in the setting, even if it's just a story like this one, or if it's on Ace Attorney Online. But obviously I much prefer the interactive format of Ace Attorney Online for videos, but I just wanted to record this anyway because it's in the same universe, and just because I really wanted to play it, and I hope you enjoyed watching it as well. Hope I could do it justice for my reading as well. A few months before writing this version of Quiero Matarte, I had the urge to create something in Twine. It's something I've been telling myself I would try for several years now, but I never got particularly far before my attention drifted elsewhere. To help learn Twine, I started writing a very rough draft of a boy's love story that I've had in mind for a while, which explores the very concept of the hero and the demon lore, popularised by works like Dragon Quest, and they're very gay for each other. This story explores messy trans thoughts a lot since the hero is a transgender man. I'll leave this description intentionally vague because it's a very real possibility I'll go back and finish the story one day once I get a better understanding of what I want to do with it. Earlier this year, 2025, my friend Castell posted about Smoochie Jam and how they hoped they could submit something to it. I was under the impression the scope of the story idea kind of got very big to the point they couldn't submit their idea to Smoochie Jam. I'm very glad they randomly posted about the competition anyway. Game jams and competitions with a specific deadline are a very good way for me to really focus on writing. I said that I'd join and just sort of wing whatever story idea I had. While seeing this prompt for Smoochie Jam, my initial idea was a boys' love story that would have starred two adventurers in the fantasy world. Both childhood friends, but one was a lot more eager and willing to be an adventurer than the other. To help motivate either friend, they would come to an agreement of sorts. Since this was a world where the characters had experience points and stats and they knew what level everyone was, they decided that every time they leveled up, they would share some sort of kiss. The only stipulation was that it could not be on ellipse. The story would basically focus on short scenes that after each level up of the two showing a different kind of kiss, all while claiming they're just totally friends and there was nothing homoerotic about what they're doing, though they'd probably be more honest by the end. And they kind of talked about this in Quiero, Matarte, right? When it was like, oh, if you're a young woman, two young women kissing each other is fine, but when you become adults, it's sort of like, what are you doing? Are you gay? Whereas for men, any sort of like, even like mild affection, like, a hug, and a hug when someone's dog just died is maybe excusable, but just a hug for the sake of a hug isn't really something that's done. It's just part of those sort of gender stereotypes, and I don't have anything more to say about that. It's just these are the societal norms that we sort of have to, try and make a bit less all-encompassing. People should really have their own choices on how to live, and they shouldn't be judged, obviously. I think if you're still watching by this point, you agree with that, right? Anyway, that's an interesting premise. As you can probably tell from the description, this is meant to be a very humorous and light-hearted short story idea. Honestly, I still think it's a very cute idea. I don't know if I'd actually write that story at any point, but I'd at least like to reuse the main duo from it somewhere, someday. I quickly realised while trying to write down the story that there was some sort of mental block in my mind. To put it another way, while the setting was meant to be a generic video game RPG setting that existed just for the sake of the story, I kept trying to reconcile the idea with my love of world building. I was trying to learn Twine, I didn't feel like all my ideas were coming together. I also felt that the story would probably have ended much longer than I intended. And so we arrive at Quiero Matarte. Properly. Finally. I still really wanted to do something for Smoochie Jam, and I finally have something in Twine that I had officially published. I remembered my old story idea for Quiero Matarte. I saw the kiss of life, kiss of death suggestion on the prompts list, and remembered that the endings I had originally envisioned for Quiero Matarte would have technically counted. So I opened up a new project and immediately started writing. Now that Quiero Matarte was being written in Twine and the fan game engine I had originally envisioned, a lot about it changed. Out went the original idea showing the final stages of a witch trial and the passivity of the original protagonist. Instead, I wanted to focus on two characters in a single room as they're forced to come to grips with their messy feelings towards each other. Two characters in a single room is a very common writing prompt because it forces me to really dig deep into a dynamic and try to come up with something that interests me to write. Marta and Raina ended up going through a lot of changes. Marta ended up being a lot more proactive, while Raina ended up being a lot more sympathetic than her original counterpart. She was always meant to be a pitiable and tragic figure, but her original incarnation was an even bigger disaster than her current version is, who hurt Marta even more and was more abusive. A more proactive Marta meant that I could imagine her as a member of the rebel forces who opposed the witch hunts easily, and this made it very easy for me to slot Raina into the role of a church soldier, since I already established the alternate history aspects. Speaking of alternate history, I wanted Raina to be a musician who played the piano. A quick search led me to realise that the piano would have been created long after what we think of as witch hunt times. I decided to keep it anyway because I thought it was a striking image, and I made my own rules for alternate, weird, soap opera history. When were pianos even made anyway? I'm not sure. Originally I planned to only have two endings where one of the characters killed the other. However, I changed my mind extremely early on when writing this version of Quiero Matarte, within the first couple of passages even. Part of this was to challenge myself, and another part of it was because I felt, unlike the original incarnations, this version of Raina and Marta might possibly have a shot at happiness. I mentioned challenging myself in my previous paragraph, so I should elaborate. I have an extremely bad habit of writing karmic justice for a lot of characters who are villainous or otherwise engage in immoral acts. Basically, without thinking about it a lot of time, I feel the need to punish such characters within the story. I don't do this intentionally, it just sort of happens, and thankfully on a case-by-case basis, this usually works for the stories I try to tell. When you look at my writing as a whole, it sticks out quite a bit and sends implications that I'm not fond of. I wanted to try and write a story with a character who had done awful things, and does more awful things in one of the endings, while still trying to give her a possible more optimistic ending, regardless of whether she deserved it or not.
we're a very self-reflexive type of person, so if some of these thoughts even appear within the story itself, as Raina wonders whether she's deserving of happiness too. I hope that this challenge to myself worked out and you like reading about Marta and Raina. I think it does make sense though, because it's not entirely selfish, because you're also stopping Marta from having to feel the pain of taking a life, so it is a good thing that Marta knocked away the knife. I ended up writing the story a few passages at a time, with the exception of 3 endings, where I ended up writing with the exception of the 3 endings where I ended up writing each one in 1 or 2 writing sessions, because I wanted to maintain focus. Since I knew the story's focus would be narrow, I hoped I'll be able to finish it by Switchy John's deadline. If you're reading this now, it means I succeeded and my writing especially paid off. I had various technical hurdles, including my laptop dying, having to get the story to a new computer, but I still did it. Wow. As I wrote the story, I grew more and more confident with Twine, so my objective of getting more comfortable with it definitely worked out. One day I'd like to experiment with more complicated stuff in Twine, but for now, I'm pretty happy with how this project turned out, growing pains and all. I think that's all I have to say. I really love Marth from Fire Emblem. That's all. I haven't actually played Fire Emblem, so but I believe that character is their profile pic, GD's profile pic, that is. That's all. Thank you for reading my weird soap operas, whether you're a first time reader or a returning one. Take care. So, second time reader technically, because Malleus was the first time, this was the second time, and like last time, I'm very happy with what we got, and I hope you are too, and I hope that you stay tuned for whatever GuardianDreamer thing I play next. But next time I have a different case lined up, and this one looks to be very interesting from reading the description. But other than the description, I literally know nothing about it, so we'll see what that's like. Might end up being another long series. We'll get back to that because we've had a little break with the fan translation and this. But I hope, even though it's not like the usual Ace Attorney case objection video, that you still enjoyed, and you'll stay tuned for next time. So yeah, bye bye.